Yes.
Taste of Monmouth?
It was good.
Yeah.
Did you go? I got my Alfano's fix. I did, actually, I didn't either. It all looked good. Is he good? So we clean going now, and then we go on the. Is Marilyn gonna go to see the houses? Okay, I know she wanted to. Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm trying to walk. I'm a big walker. You feel like I'm eating too much, and I need to. I'm starting to right now. Were you in the one with Thank you very much. Yeah, he's got houses. Yeah. I was in a couple. I saw him on Facebook. We were in a couple. And the Mom Couch Facebook page, yeah. Somebody's posting. But no, you guys are going tomorrow morning. You said. Are you going to have breakfast or are you just going to sit down Of course, absolutely.
Just for you. Come on in.
We got one here too. Okay. Bill, we got one here if you want. Oh, there we go. There you go.
Oh, okay. And of course, now that I realize I forgot my water.
Uh-oh. Yes, we got. Oh, it's the wellness, but I'm going to go to that. Yeah, I'm really interested in that. We got a lot of fitness things, you know, we'll work out. Like, we got something. And then, yeah, the wine tasting. Yeah, but this one is right at the building we've been at, the science building. And then, yeah, then we come over here. Yeah. Oh, okay, I see what you're saying with the library. Yep.
Hello, everybody. Hello. Are we all absolutely stuffed from that taste of Monmouth? Yeah. Hello. Show of hands, did anybody complete the menu? No. No? You did? I'll be honest, I completed the menu and had like 4 tacos all at the same time. I have a soft spot for that taco truck. So yeah, phenomenal food. Hope you all enjoyed it. We're gonna get started here, and I get the pleasure of introducing Chuck Bushy. Chuck is a member of the 1973 class. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, sure, why not? He is a member of the International Association of Wildland Fire and acting strategic coordination advisor. He previously served as the president from 2007 to 2011. He is the president of the Montana Prescribed Fire Services Incorporated. He is the fire behavior analyst and a retired fire ecologist. Chuck sits on the Wildland Fire Leadership Council, of which he is the Western Region International Association of Wildland Fire representative and the Yellowstone County, Montana Local Emergency Planning Council. That's a title. He is also a retired International Association of Wildland Fire representative of the CDC NIOSH Scientific Subcommittee for the National Firefighter Registry. Please join me with a loud round of applause for Chuck Bushy.
Well, apologies beforehand. I haven't given a presentation since 2019, pre-COVID.
Oh,
So I even had to relearn how to build PowerPoints. That sort of threw the world into a tizzy. Everybody here okay with the microphone? Yeah, it sounds the same to me here. That picture there is a picture of sort of the state of the art that we have now in terms of fire modeling. Able to build a fire on the landscape, either a real one that's actually occurring or one that we can imagine on either real landscape or landscape that is devised. And just a quick explanation, a lot of that's forest. You got a community down here. Our fires nowadays are impacting our communities and infrastructure more and more. And while, let's see. Give me 2 hours. Is this gonna work? Okay, since they invited me to come and speak, I spent a lot of time reminiscing, which I haven't done in a long time, about how I got to this particular spot. I wanted to start with Dr. Bowman, but with I had second thoughts. I've always been sort of a child of nature, the forests and the prairies, and wandered in as a young boy. And then also very interested in natural events that had a lot of energy involved in. And my first experience with wildland fire was when I was 11 years old. And we had a grassland fire that started in an area that's a park now, but it was just prairie at the time. Prairie ran down into a marsh area. The fire followed the fuels. And we'll talk about fuels later. But the city fire department came out, dutifully put the fire out, and left. Except they didn't have the fire out totally because they didn't understand the fire. The fire had burned the surface fuels and then gone underground. And it burned there all winter. And by walking around out in that marsh area, you could see the steam coming up from the ground, where the fire was underground and burning in the peat. And it was just a smoldering combustion. You didn't see any flames. And then every now and then, if you weren't careful, your foot would break through the ground, and it was hot underneath. So, come spring, the vegetation, the snow disappeared, the vegetation was still brown, dried out, the fire started again. The fire department ran out there with their fire truck, raced down the hill towards where the fire was down in the marsh area. The fire truck fell through the ground, buried itself to the top of the wheelhouse. They were not able to get that truck out. It burned. And that was really my first experience with wildland fires. And ever since then, I've had peat fires sort of in the back of my mind. And associated with peat fires is a lot of smoke. And those are the two biggest topics we have nowadays that are really unsolved problems in our Wildland fire community. So, starting in Monmouth College now. Came from a large, far northern Chicago suburb, big high school. And I was looking for a small Illinois college with a good science curriculum that was willing to take me.
What
For
was,
one
what was the suburb? What was the name of the
Waukegan,
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Birthplace of Jack Denny, Ray Bradbury, yeah, a few other people, but those are the two prominent ones. So, right on Lake Michigan, halfway between Chicago and Milwaukee. My very first 8 a.m. science class was with Dr. Bowman. And of course, it was in the old science building. So we get over there. I'm new on campus, had no idea where I was going. I get there, I'm a little bit late, and I'm not the only one. The door slams and click. He duffs out in the hallway for a couple minutes as he made a speech to the class, which we could hear through the door, about never being late for one of his classes and taking copious notes. And if we studied hard, we might be able to pass the course. He turned out to be my advisor, but that wasn't what you'd call a real good start to our relationship. But he did turn out to be an excellent advisor, set the pace for me in terms of ecology, because at that time I didn't have fire particularly set in my mind. But it was a good start. After graduating here in '73, went back, spent a little bit of time looking for a job, as we all do. And I ended up with a naturalist, biologist position with Lake County, Illinois Forest Preserve District. Basically, Cook County line up to the Wisconsin line. So that was home territory for me. And had a number of different assignments. Was manager of the Ryerson Conservation Area. Anybody here's ever been there? It's a beautiful spot. There's a few. Mature old growth forest, sugar maple, and a number of others, what we call mesic, between wet and dry species, right along the floodplain of the Des Plaines River. And it was an area that was, as I learned through learning about the area, had been protected from fire. It was an area that was protected because of the Des Plaines River, the prevailing direction of the winds, and the glacial moraines, which broke up the fire as it would burn across the country. And fire was a prominent part of our landscape. Always has been. In fact, the first white settler in the county, Captain Daniel Wright from Vermont, had his cabin right across the river from the Ryerson Conservation Area. His wife and 2 children died in the prairie fire. So, that was my first job. It was a great beginning position. From there, I'd like to say coerced into leaving the natural world and being a environmental consultant for a large environmental consulting firm. Most of our work dealt with the power industry, especially nuclear power plants. But at that time, nuclear power was sort of on the downturn. Fewer and fewer sites getting registered. All sorts of problems there relating to the nuclear power industry. It was after 2 Mile Island, 12 Mile Island, 3 Mile Island. It was a while ago. So the company was in trouble. Not necessarily the section that we worked for, which was the environmental science section, but because the company was losing income because they held a patent for lead in gasoline. And that was being taken out of the gasoline supply, so they were losing income. Which, of course, that was different than hiring brochure. They also had some problems with testing of beauty products on lab animals. and falsifying the results, which became public. So, short story is, they were bought, dismantled. I ended up being first person fired in the third cut. That was a learning experience in itself as well. So where to then? Southern Illinois University. Decided to go back and work on my master's. Reason I went there is they had a really good botany department. And with my work with both the Nalco Environmental Sciences and the Forest Preserve District, botany was obviously the direction I was going in land management. So ended up having to go to a big school. And I also had a lot of friends there, and through my networking, had gotten to know some of the professors there. While I was at SIU Carbondale, I taught, I was a teaching assistant for a Rocky Mountain Field Ecology course, where we went and spent a month in the Rocky Mountains. During that month, we had 2 days off. It was very intense, and got to know some of the people in the Forest Service out in Montana, and especially at the fire lab in Missoula, Montana. And when I went back to SIU to finish work on my thesis, one morning I got a call from the fire lab asking me if I would come out and work with them in research projects. And my first response was, well, how soon do you need me? I can be there tomorrow. Not that quite that quick. So, yeah, so the beginning of summer I went out there. I ended up finishing my master's long distance. We had a variety of fire research topics, mostly centered in western Montana, northern Idaho, but my extent went down into the rangelands in the Great Basin, Nevada, Utah, southern Idaho, that country. And you can see there, again, fire effects on both plants and animals, how fire interacts with the animals. First order fire effects is what we call, it would be consumption by the fire, or mortality in some respect. Second order fire effects and onwards are various instances of the plants surviving of the fire and either them growing and receding or animals eating. Those are all different effects that we ended up studying from the fire. And humans have a big involvement in that too. Some of the tribes I've worked with, we would say that they have had thousands of years of learning the hard way. They've gotten to fourth and fifth order fire effects. And what I'll come back to later is fire behavior service centers. That ends up being an important part for me. You remember the days when computers basically filled a room and you put your data in on a key punch card? You know, did a lot of that. So most of the summer, spring, fall, we were out in the mountains. We were studying fires, or setting up areas that would be burned in the near future, and getting baseline data. And the worst part of the winter, we would be in crunching data, writing reports, or going skiing. Yeah, it was nice living in Missoula. Within an hour and a half drive, we had 6 different ski areas. So that's where I learned how to downhill ski. Certainly not in Montana. In 1985, I started my own private company with a co-founder. And we did contract work with the fire lab, so my research projects continued for quite some time. But the main thing was we provided prescribed fire, the RX fire, which which is RX for prescribed, to both private sector and the government. Usually it was government projects that for one reason or another, they didn't think themselves capable to handle, and they needed a greater level of expertise than what they really had available. And then burning on the large private ranches for a variety of land management purposes. It was a very select clientele. It's hard to convince somebody to pay you to send their money up in smoke. So, but the people that were willing, they had seen the fire effects from previous events, had an idea of what could possibly be done on their property if it was done correctly. Wildland fire doesn't always burn the way the landowner wants it to. So if you can go in there and do it in certain respects, you can get certain results that fits their land management goals. Initially, most of the ranchers wanted it burned from fence line to fence line for maximum rangeland grass production for their livestock and for wildlife. Can't keep the wildlife out. As we went on, we started to convince them that not only could we do that, but we could also burn and create a variety of different stages of vegetation succession within their managed areas. And so we could design a fire to kill, say, sagebrush, but leave the branches and everything still standing. That would trap snow in the winter for increased soil moisture. Or we could burn the sagebrush, just slick it right off at the ground. And we did the same thing with forest areas. Other things that we did, we were burning about 50,000 acres a year. Had a team of about 35 individuals. Most of that were people that worked with us on a seasonal basis. Had a core staff of 4. And we did a variety of different things besides just prescribed burning and wildfire suppression. We had a strike team of wildland Indians. They traveled all over the U.S. helping in fire suppression wherever we were dispatched. And then we also did consulting, fire training, arson investigations, which was an interesting sideline. WUI, fuel mitigation. WUI is wildland urban interface. It's the mixture of homes and communities with the native vegetation. People like to build their homes out in the woods. Well, it's a fire, that's just another form of fuel. So, and there's things that you can do to mitigate that potential result. So, we did a lot of that. And that started back in the Clinton administration, when they were getting funding for that. We did some UXO work, which is unexploded ordnance on military bases. That was fun and very interesting. We did FX work, special effects, and site location and climatology work for the movie industry. Most of the movies we worked on never made it past the cutting room floor. Maybe one that you might be familiar with. How many people saw Lonesome Dove? Quite a few. How many of you saw Return to Lonesome Dove, sequel? A whole lot less. But we did all the fire scenes in Return to Lonesome Dove, where a lightning strike occurs, the ranch house burns down in a prairie fire. We did the prairie fire, we did the burning house.
So at the end of the movie, when they give all the credits, you up there?
Actually, we weren't. We were contract to the company, the California company, that had the special effects contract. But we did all that work for them. But it was fun. And they had really good meals. So that was an interesting sideline. And then as a fire behavior analyst, and a fire ecologist for the agencies wherever they needed it. This is a good place to start what I call Monmouth College Wildland Fire 101. Most of you have probably not had much experience with fire directly. How many people here maybe have? A few hands are up. Actually, everyone here should raise your hand. Maybe you weren't near the flames, but you were breathing the smoke. And the smoke travels around the world. It's a global phenomenon. And it can be hazardous to your health. So everybody here has had some impact from wildland fire. We like to live in the world of triangles here, and you can see there a series of triangles on a scale of time, the scale of space. The main thing between all of these is fuel and vegetation. Fuel equals vegetation. It's the same thing. And it doesn't necessarily have to be dead and dried out. It can burn when it's green. Florida especially is a really good example of that. A few days after it rains, everything's greened up, it burns really well. Earth is a fire planet, and always has been ever since we have oxygen available to burn. There's a site in west coast of Ireland, maybe Northern Ireland, where a very early form of vegetation that had moved out of the ocean onto land and looked sort of like a large mushroom. It was like a mushroom forest. And they found this location, and it had been burned by a fire. So this is the very first instances of life, and that was a fuel. Oxygen was present. The oxygen was coming from blue-green algae that was growing in the oceans. All vegetation and fuel. Fuel comes in different sizes, varies in continuity, and varies in live and dead and moisture content. If it has oxygen and a heat source, it will burn. Small fuels burn more readily but quicker, such as the grass in the picture here, as opposed to maybe some of the larger branches that are out underneath the trees. Fuel continuity, where you have a continuous run of the grass in the picture here, that contributes to fire spread. The stream here could break up the fire spread, and that would break up fire continuity, and that varies across the landscape. Some fuels burn better than others. Fuel is arranged in beds on the landscape. And we're looking here at a series of pictures. You can see at the top there, we've got some very large down trees. Those are very large fuel particles. This lower picture here is Snoqualmie Falls in Washington. You can see sort of a continuous landscape of fuels. Once fire gets up and running in some of these, they can go on for miles and miles and miles. Historically, before European settlement, our fires did burn for hundreds of miles. And it wasn't uncommon for fires to start in the Rocky Mountains, burn all the way across the prairies to the Mississippi River, go across the Mississippi River, and continue burning in the prairies of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and into the eastern deciduous forest. And at one time, the fires went all the way to the East Coast. And we can tell that by the vegetation patterns. In fact, while I was working on my master's, I came across a citation by an early forester. And he was complaining that he was having problems doing his work because the smoke was so thick across the Father of Waters, the Mississippi River. And this was down in southern Illinois, smoke coming from the Missouri side. Insects and disease can impact fuel oils. And a recent example of that is the mountain python beetle epidemic that we had, where because of a period of time when the climate was not capable of causing mortality in the pine beetle, the populations exploded. There was a lot of food for it, but what was really the limiting factor was the cold temperatures. And our winters were warming up. And the mountain pine beetle went from very localized events, it was always there, but it was very localized small spots, to being an epidemic that went from the forests of New Mexico and Utah, all the way up the Rocky Mountain spine, over into Canada, continuing up the Rocky Mountains on the west side, in Alberta, British Columbia. We thought when it finally got to some of the colder areas in the northern Rockies, that would stop the epidemic, because it was primarily feeding on lodgepole pine and ponderosa pine. And we thought the cold temperatures and the change of forest type would stop the epidemic. Little to our experience, the species of pine beetle changed food types. When the forest changed, it just ate what was available, which was the black spruce forest. And we were afraid at that time that this pine beetle epidemic was going to move right across northern Canada. It didn't. We ended up with some cold temperatures that dropped the population back. And then we've had periods of fire that had broken up the landscape, creating discontinuity in the fuel bed, which also broke up the ability of the pine beetle to spread. Topography is the only variable on our triangles that does not change, at least within our timelines. And fire, as you see here, is a picture of some lightning strikes in British Columbia. Fire can rapidly, given the proper circumstances, run up slopes. Given the proper circumstances, it can also go very fast down slopes. Upslope is easier. And grass fuels on flat terrain can also burn very rapidly, especially prone to wind speeds and wind shifts. And even though it's an area of relatively light fuels compared to the forest, it's also one of our most hazardous fuel types because the fire can move so quickly through the grass and it catches people unaware. Most of our wildland fire fatalities and firefighters have been the grassland fuel types. Weather is now or a few days from now, basically what's being forecast. As you can see on your TV or listen to on your radio or on the internet. We end up being much more specific in our wildland fire behavior prediction because we need more exact weather conditions. Not only on a large synoptic scale, but also locally. And this young lady here is what we call an FBN, a fire behavior analyst, and she's taking a weather reading that she can relay to the crews that are out in the fire line, any changing conditions, so they can become aware of potential changes in fire behavior. Everything is key about safety. Climate is the long term. Typically, based on the Weather Service, they put it into 30-year increments. And what was it? I think it was just last year they updated the last 30 years. Climatology is a major influence on vegetation growth and patterns. If you have drought, you're going to have less vegetation. If you have more rainfall, you're going to get more vegetation. Shifting vegetation patterns based on the species need for those local resources. It can change ignition patterns. And we can see here thunderstorms that are poking up through the clouds. And a big part of our ignitions, especially out west and in Florida, is lightning. And of course, all that influences the fire behavior. Oops. Fire behavior comes in all flavors. And it depends upon what is in that triangle that we were looking at earlier. And you need to constantly have your situational awareness of your surroundings and environment. Otherwise, you can very quickly put yourself in a hazardous situation. Fire behavior is commonly described as low, such as the one picture up here where it's burning through pine needles, only a few inches high, to moderate. We've got a grassland fire here, flames 3 to 5 feet in height. Or it could be high, where you see a forest here, sort of a lodgepole pine, and the fire is moving through the forest, what we call torching, going up the tops of the trees. Not necessarily a running fire, but just very active burning. And usually with the high fire behavior, we start experiencing what we call spotting, where you get embers from the trees or other fuel types that are being thrown out in front of the fire. And that would depend upon, again, on your plant species, going back to botany, and your weather conditions, and what sort of breakup of fuel continuity you might have. In the western U.S., spotting distances of a quarter mile with relatively low wind speeds is fairly common. So you're not only working your fire line to make a break for the flames, but you got to keep your mindset on what's on the other side of you, because there's embers traveling over your head and coming down in the fuels on the other side. Under certain weather conditions, we can have spot fires travel up to 12 miles here in North America. After that, they pretty much burn out, and that depends again on the vegetation type. Australia is a little bit different. Eucalyptus is the primary carrier of spotting in Australia, and it's like 200 different species of trees and shrubs. But the bark tends to curl and stays on the trees for quite a while. The fire, which burns up the trees survive the fire, but the fire gets inside the curl of the bark and can get ripped off the tree and carried in the wind a distance up to 25 miles. So people may think, oh yeah, there's a fire over there, it's not much concern. It's way out there. Next thing they know, they have these embers dropping on them and the community, and it's too late to evacuate. Most civilians die in the evacuation process of a fire. So, running off the road in the smoke, crashing into other cars, panic. And both here in the U.S. as well as in Canada, Australia, those are the three main areas for wildland fire. That's a major problem. Variables such as rate of spread for the fire, flame height, spotting distance. We use these to help describe the fire behavior that's being observed or that we're trying to predict. And then on rare occasions, we get what we call extreme fire behavior, which is really fun. In fact, we've been seeing a lot of that up in Canada recently. Very early in the season for them. It tends to be off our charts. It's still beyond our capability to predict the fire behavior under these circumstances. We're starting to get better at being able to predict when and where these circumstances may occur, but we can't necessarily model the fire behavior that's going to happen. Examples include running forest fire in the crowns of forest, just racing across the top of the forest. And a lot of times you have the crown of the forest burning first, and it's exposed to the upper level winds at the treetop level, so that's being pushed. And then half hour, an hour later, there's a second fire front that's burning on the ground following it with lesser winds from underneath. So that's a circumstance you have to be able to. Fire tornadoes and what we call pyro-CDs. Most people are familiar with dust devils. Most fire tornadoes are literally a dust devil. They're small, very short-lived, areas of fuel and heat concentration that usually dissipate fairly quickly. In fact, in our prescribed burning, there were many times we would, just for the fun of it, we would instigate fire wars through our burning pattern and the layout of the fuel on the landscape. We would have the fire race uphill, the tornado, get to the top of a knob on the hill, and it would leap off into the air. That was usually what we tried to do, just for the fun of it. Other times that didn't work so well, and I can remember having my arm wrapped around a big Douglas fir, putting out embers beyond our fire line with a hose, and the fire was continuing to come. And I'm just wrapped up, my arm wrapped around, holding the spot, and as long as my water kept going, I was putting those embers out. So sometimes having fun can be exciting. And just as an example, in 2003 in Canberra, Australia, they had a fire tornado that came through. It was ranked an F3 on the scale. It killed 4 people, injured almost 500. And we've had some really big tornadoes, becoming a much more common feature in our extreme fire behavior. Pyro-CBs, that's an abbreviation for pyrocumulonimbus. Cumulonimbus are thunderstorms, but these pyro-CBs can be much bigger than a thunderstorm. A few decades back, these were relatively rare events. We might get maybe 1 or 2 that we can do within a decade. And they may have been more frequently, but we just didn't search for them back then. Since '88, we've been more or less trying to keep an eye on this type of event. Very similar to like a volcanic eruption, except the heat here is being provided by forest fuels generally. And fire over a large area, creating a lot of heat that's creating uplift. And you can see here, the fire is inside there. All this air is rushing into the cloud. And as long as there's sufficient heat, that just keeps going higher and higher and higher. It's not unusual for these clouds to be getting up to 60, 70,000 feet. Your normal jet travels about 35,000 feet. So twice the height of a jet. It's literally sucking dirt, fire embers, trees, way up into the clouds. The heavy stuff, of course, drops out. The other stuff is getting vaporized. And when it gets up to the top there, the very top of the cloud, it's turning very cold at those high elevations. Commonly minus 40 to minus 60s, minus 70 degrees centigrade. And we really don't have any understanding of what is happening up there in terms of cold organic chemistry and what it's doing to our atmosphere. We're starting to get some indication that these are producing ozone holes. And if you remember back in the 80s, 90s, we were having problems with ozone holes in the southern hemisphere from fluorocarbons. Now this is a totally different animal, but seems to be producing possibly the same impacts. And we're starting to, I mentioned there maybe a few a decade. We're starting to see up to 90 a year. Primarily Russia, Canada, US. So it's primarily Northern Hemisphere. The Australians are putting up their fair share, but they're the main source for the Southern Hemisphere. So not as much down there. So it's something that we're working on. We still got a long ways to go. but very impressive with us.
What about lack of oxygen? As you go up, you get less and less oxygen.
Yeah. So if something is an ember and burning, that will go out, but it keeps getting wafted up. And so all that organic material, it's interacting with other organic materials and cold temperatures and doing chemical things that we have no clue to. So, and then of course that travels around the world. There was one packet of smoke from a pyro CD that started in Siberia a few years back. And we were able to track that 5 times around the globe as a coherent packet of smoke before it finally got torn apart by a typhoon north of Japan. So these are having long-term impacts. And like I say, we're all being impacted by this because it gets mixed throughout our atmosphere. And we're breathing it. So it's not just the firefighters, it's everybody. These pictures are from, let's see, May 4th, I believe, this year. Smoke from pyro CDs in Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia. The colors over here are what we call the aerosols, the smoke that's being given off by the fires and concentrated. And you can see how it's swirling around the clouds. There's a piece that's being torn off that's going south, going down into Iowa, Illinois, and then eventually ended up around Washington, D.C. area. The other part ended up over Northern Europe and continued traveling around, and it's already made a complete circuit. And of course, these are ongoing. The fires are still going, still putting up more smoke. Plus, we've got fires now in Ontario province that are putting up their own smoke. So, no matter what the intensity or severity of fire, nature always springs back. Something to keep in mind when we go out there to put fires out. Frequently, our vegetation is adapted for fire, both the vegetation and the wildlife. They've grown up with fire for millions of years, and they're still around. Maybe they've changed a little bit. A lot of the vegetation has built adaptations to survive fire or to reproduce following a fire. Yep. This is definitely a fire plant. And as long as we have oxygen, it will remain so. So if it doesn't become a fire plant, we won't have to worry about it. Fire Behavior Service Centers, I mentioned them earlier on. At the Fire Lab, we began to develop ways to assist fire behavior analysts that were on the individual fire incidents. Their nose was to the ground of what was going on their fire. They did not have the big picture. And so we developed this Fire Behavior Service Center concept that provided that big picture and passed that down to the individuals describing fire behavior on the ground, and there was a constant feedback back and forth. Started small in 1985 when we went out to a fire on the Flathead National Forest that burned into the southern part of Glacier Park. They were using, up to this point, TI-59s, handheld calculators, for running the fire behavior equations. It was a very slow, laborious process. And so the Fire Lab had been working on computerizing that whole process, getting away from the TI-59s. But that was just confined to the laboratory, to the computer at the Fire Lab in Missoula. We didn't have any way of getting this computer information out to the field. Technology had not advanced that far. So for the very first time in 1984, we ran a landline from our fire camp to the Hungry Horse Ranger District on the Flathead Forest and hooked up a live line from the district office to the Fire Lab in Missoula, and were able to do these calculations on our computer terminal. that was a major step forward. And not only were we able to do that practically in real time, but we were also able to have all these other people in the fire camp that were involved in finances, logistics, looking over our shoulders and going, can we do that too? And of course they could. You know, and it was just a matter of a very short period of time before we started having computers involved with the fire behavior service centers and in the individual fire camps. I also claim responsibility for having the first, or being responsible for the first GPS units on a wildland fire, where they were doing continual mapping of all the things related to the fire, roads in and out, helitack, base camps, where the crews were located, fuels, where the fire perimeters were, how the fire was progressing from one day to the next. And it just blew the fire staff away. They just could not get enough of it. They wanted more and more and more. And GPS is just a normal part of the fire process now. When was that? That was 2000. So not that long ago, relatively speaking. We were combining all sorts of different subroutines to run these behave programs, more than what we could do with the TI-59. And the whole purpose was to keep firefighters safe. And not only the firefighters, but also communities that would be down with it. We were always trying to figure out, okay, we've got a town down there. Is the fire moving in that direction based on the weather patterns that we're seeing? If so, how fast might it move? And I always remember being in northern Minnesota in the Arrowhead area and talking to a community about fire in the Boundary Water Canoe area that was actively burning, had been for several days. They were having problems putting it out. And the mayor of the town stood up and asked me, Chuck, how long of a warning time period do we have to be able to evacuate if we need to? And I told him, maybe 4 hours. And you could just see the whole room's jaws drop. They were thinking days. They had days to move. When these fires get up and move, they go quick. And if you're not prepared for that movement, you're going to end up being trapped in. Sometimes you have to think outside the box. The SR-71 Blackbird, it was a spy plane run by the Air Force. Usually it transited over Russia at high elevations, went faster than their missiles could be fired at it. Based out of Maelstrom Air Force Base in Great Falls, Montana. When it was on the ground and cooled, it leaked like a sea. All the pieces were loose, and all the fluids would just leak out of the plane. They were constantly having to be replenished. And so, you know, the idea was behind when it got up and flying at high speeds, it was red hot, and all the parts expanded and filled all those voids, and it was no longer leaking. It worked really well. It's just on the ground, it looked terrible. So periodically they had to take this SR-71 and give it test runs. So in 1988, I was having problems getting not only sufficient weather information from our network that we had with the Weather Service, with forest lookouts. I needed more information. And we were also having problems discovering new fire ignitions. Sometimes it would be several days before we actually saw a new fire pop up, but it had already been burning for several times, several days, and had spread. So by the time they got to it, it was more of a problem than if it was just a small spot fire that instantly jump on. So I called up Melster and asked if they would be willing to use their spy plane technology on test flights going from Great Falls, Montana to Seattle, turn around and come back with their IR technology, their infrared, where it was picking up heat sources. And I said, sure, that's no problem. We're going to be doing these anyways. All we have to do is push a button. And they would run at night. The next morning I'd show up at 6 a.m. That canister of film would be sitting on my desk. Then came the hard part, which was interpreting the film. So you not only had all the potential ignitions from fires, but you had hot car engines, rocks that were still heated from the daylight sunshine, all sorts of things that we had to segregate out and figure out where we wanted to look at where were potential emissions. And then another instance, again, going back to the weather stations. The military in Montana has a large portion of our nuclear missile deterrent system. Something over 170 different nuclear missile silos. And they're all remote locations, guarded electronically. You can't get close to them without alarms going off all over the place. But they also are periodically visited by the military by helicopter. And they go out there, and if you have a helicopter coming in, you need to know what the local weather conditions are. So they all had weather stations. And the Air Force is more than willing to share their weather information. And over the years, Department of Defense has become a much greater partner in wildland fire, both prescribed fire and the wildland section. They're one of the larger landowners we have in the country, all over the East Coast and the West Coast. Oh, and that particular SR-71 that we're using, that's now the one in the Smithsonian. I mentioned the purpose being to preserve life. If you're in this business long enough, you lose friends and acquaintances. I've lost quite a few. In the picture on top, those are individuals that were fatality on the Storm King Mountain fire, Glenwood, Colorado. They got there a couple days after the fire started. They were working, the fire was burning on the slope here. They were working downhill, and you can see sort of the fire line that they were digging as that off color in the more constant green vegetation, that stripe that comes down. They had a dry cold front come through with a wind shift and windy conditions. And the wind swept the fire up through the area that had already burned, but it had burned low on the ground, carried the fire up into the top of this gamble oak, which grows about 5 to 6 feet tall, not very big, but proper conditions is highly flammable. And it chased them up the slope. And members of the Prineville Hotshots, the Missoula Smoke Jumpers, the McCall Smoke Jumpers, and a helitack crew were overrun, 14 fatalities. Part of what I used to do with the Fire Behavior Service Center when I was based in Missoula or other locations was go out and inform incoming crews what the current situation was on the fires, what we were seeing, what they had to anticipate. And the smoke jumpers, I'd go over there every morning and give them a briefing. I'd give them a briefing early on. An hour later, they received a call to go to Colorado, which was out of my area of jurisdiction. I didn't know until hours later that they were even there. There were survivors, shattered individuals. They're still suffering, and their families are suffering, as are the ones for the members that were killed. Entrapment, such as this set of circumstances. is the #1 killer of firefighters, where flames will overrun the individual or a crew. The second greatest cause of wildland fire fatalities are air crashes, airplanes. And a lot of that was due to earlier years where we had fire retardant bombers that were leftovers from the Second World War. They were old airplanes. They weren't designed for fighting fires. They were reconfigured. They were operating in mountainous terrain, high elevations where the air is thinner, hot situations where again the air is thinner, and in many cases it was beyond the capability of the aircraft to sustain flight. And you can see on this one picture again, this was taken just a couple years after the fire. The Gamble Oak's already all greened up. What was the point of having the firefighters there? Nothing was killed, nothing was changed. And that's a common situation that we have, where the vegetation is adapting to fire. It's just that we're in this mindset that we have to put it out no matter what. And so you call the resources to do it. More times you do that, the greater odds that sooner or later, Mother Nature's going to come and bite you in the butt. Lightning detection and mapping. This was some technology that was just beginning when I arrived at the fire lab. The Bureau of Land Management was building a lightning detection network across the entire western U.S. And I was able to use that network with real-time lightning strikes and be able to determine which ones were cloud to ground, which were the only ones that we were really interested in, and which ones were positive strokes and which ones were negative strokes, and be able to get a rough idea of the number of new ignitions that we were going to get in particular field types. And so I could be working with the local national forest, saying you got a thunderstorm coming through this area, it's going to be passing through in an hour, 2 hours. Based on current conditions that we're seeing, you can expect 5 new fires in this area. You can go ahead and pre-position your crews, pre-position your wildland engines, and be able and ready to do initial attack. My career is overlapping here a lot. While I was working at the fire lab, I also became involved with the International Association of Wildland Fire. It's a 501(c)(3), has 15 international board members. I had several officer positions before I became president of the association. And like was mentioned, I'm currently titled the Strategic Coordination Advisor. Fancy term for whatever I want it to be. They didn't have anything like Professor Emeritus or anything like that. And this is the mission statement, which basically says our main purpose is educating the global wildland fire community about wildland fire, its behavior, and its impacts. And we do this through a variety of different tools. The organization started with the journal, International Journal of Wildland Fire. That was the original purpose, was to get this peer-reviewed scientific journal off the ground. And this was before I was involved. But I became quickly involved after it was established. There wasn't anything out there that researchers could put their publications into that would get general dissemination in the scientific community around the world, other than competing with other ecological journals. And it was really difficult to get fire-related information into those. So it's a solution. Let's start our own. Wildfire Magazine. which if you're interested, we've got a box here of our most current issue over there someplace, okay? And if you're interested, you can go ahead and grab one of these. Articles from around the globe. And that goes out every 2 months. Wildfire Today and Fire Aviation, 2 blogs that a good friend of mine, who was also my first executive director, started. And he recently passed. And before he passed, we had talked about succession of his work into IAWF. We had talked about this like 10 years before, preparing for the eventuality, which everybody should do at some point in their lives. Not just businesses, but individuals and families. So just recently, Bill passed away, and these are new additions to the IAWF communications suite. And then we have our e-news, which goes out to the members, telling them about local IAWF organizational activities. And then we have wildland fire conferences that we have going on all around the world. Right now, we're planning for an event in April, taking into account time zones. We're going to be having this fire behavior and fuels conference in Boise, Idaho, Melbourne, Australia, and Tylee, Ireland, all about the same time. And then connected electronically, so we can exchange keynote speakers. But each one is going to be designed to their own flavor, for their own fire behavior, their own fuel types, but important speeches and stuff will be communicated electronically. We do annually our national cohesive strategy management workshops, which, what was it? 2010, I think. The Forest Service was getting overwhelmed by the increasing number of wildland fires that they were having to deal with. It was severely impacting their budget. Other than fire, activities such as trail maintenance, putting in new campgrounds, forestry activities, the budgets for those were getting eaten up by fire. Forest Service realized they needed to have a more cohesive fire management strategy, not only connecting themselves and the other federal and their state partners and tribal organizations, but all the way down to grassroots organizations, such as Pheasants Forever, Ducks Unlimited, local groups that are interested in local management of the landscape, their properties as well as the federal and state properties. And that all of these people should be involved in developing the fire management strategy going forward. And so that's 13 years now. I'm surprised it's lasted this long. It's had its ups and downs. But it was a good idea. And it's still working. And you can see we've got a number of other different conferences. And then we also partner with a wide variety of other organizations that in one way or another are interested in wildland fire. So have I retired? Not really. I've just sort of changed my colors a little bit. Still keeping in touch with this global Pyro CD monitoring group. In fact, I think yesterday I probably had about 20 emails from them monitoring what was going on in Canada. That's our primary concern. But also we're watching a new fire that's a couple days old that is actively burning in Scotland, south of Inverness. It's now the largest historically known fire in Scotland. Things are changing. Europe has always had fire along the Mediterranean countries. Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal, southern France. That fire climate is rapidly moving north. And we're getting more and more fires in Europe, UK, Scandinavia. Ireland always burns. Everybody thinks of Ireland as being emerald green all the time. It isn't. They have a season where their grasses go dormant, and people go out and burn their ditches or burn their heather fields or whatever. The weather catches them unprepared, and they end up with some really big fires. So I've spent quite a few years working in Northern Ireland and Ireland. It was mentioned the National Firefighter Registry, which was something, again, I started working on when I was president of IWF. The CDC was starting to look at the potential impacts of smoke on firefighters. And the idea was to do some initial research. They started with 2 fire departments that had very stable populations of firefighters, long-term people who lived in it, day after day for years. Chicago Fire Department, and then the Phoenix Fire Department. Some of the results, they came back after a couple of years of study were totally unexpected and very scary. Not only for just the normal population, but special effects for female firefighters, people in certain occupations within the structural firefighting community. And when they started this initial research, I called them up and asked, well, how come you're not doing any wildland firefighting? And I could hear silence on the other end of the phone. They had no clue what a wildland firefighter was. These were city researchers from the CDC NIOSH that the only firefighter community they knew was structural firefighters with shiny trucks that drove up and down streets. So I opened up a whole new Pandora's box for them, which just in the beginning of May, we finally got the registry open for national registration of people that are either in the industry, structural, or wildland, to register, as well as retirees. And they put in their private information. It's all kept anonymous. Their health records go into their local state organizations. And then the CDC, again anonymously, can pull this information and run statistics on it to see if there is actually any correlation between their industry, the jobs they're doing, and cancer causes. So people think there's obviously a relationship. We don't really know for sure. We think there is, but we don't really know for sure. After the study's been going for maybe about 5 years, we'll have a better handle on that. I've been acting for the last 8 years as our liaison with our European cohorts in Wildland Fire, getting them ready for what was coming their direction, which is now in their backyards. They were in denial. They go, oh yes, Southern Europe, they always have fire, just like California always has fire. Fire's been moving north. Climate's been moving north. Last year, London had a record high temperature of over 90 degrees. They consider it hot when they break 70. So this was a major impact. And they had a wildland fire on the fringe of London that burned into the wildland urban interface, that burned down 5 apartment buildings. And that really threw everybody to a system. So COVID did slow things down a little bit. 2019, I was over in Europe 6 times, 2020 so. And then serve on several IAWF committees. We've got a mentoring committee for assigning mentees, mentors, for people all around the world. They go through a review process and assign a mentor. And then I'm chair of their long-range conference planning committee. So we're looking at 10 years in the future, maybe longer than I'll be around. So, a lot we didn't cover about wildland fire, my career in the industry. We just sort of went over the surface. And hopefully that going over the surface didn't put everybody to sleep. Do we have time for questions, or are we closing down?
Unfortunately, no.
Okay, at this time. I will be around the rest of the day and tomorrow.
Like Chuck said, there are Wildland Fire magazines over there, free for the taking. Please take one when you leave. And we will have golf carts outside ready to start transporting people over to your next segments.